So hello everyone, this is our group and we're going to start answering the questions. So for the first question, how do we define violence and how do we observe it? So in class we already started talking about the definition of violence, how it's present when there's harm or when someone's potential realization is greater than their actual realization. And we realized in our group, we really talked that violence could either be a situation or a condition, or it could be a tool. So violence isn't restricted to a condition. It can be used to do something, to resolve a conflict or anything. But then how do we observe it? So we were a bit intrigued by that because we realized that we can really observe like personal violence when there are actual actors and oppressors, because I mean, if you see somebody punch a person, then that's violence. So you can see that. However, we try to how do we observe structural violence? And there we kind of hit a wall. We're like, can people just see structural violence? And we realized that it was a lot harder because there are no actors, and that we would probably need data or studies, investigations, or statistics to identify these structural violence. And so we would need resources to do that. So it's another step, so another obstacle to identify this type of violence.
Building off of that, and thinking about how our different definitions of violence and how a person defines violence can change their conception of the world. One of the points that was brought up in our discussion was, can we call violence or like a revolution resistance instead of violence, even if it is like a quote unquote violent revolution, because it is violence in that aspect is being used as a tool against the oppressor. And so we had a worldview or a definition of violence where we viewed revolutional violence as resistance, then we think that a person who had that definition would be more accepting and more open to those revolutions and to that resistance, and to those protests. Whereas as someone who defines all violence as bad and all violence as not, then they would not support those revolutions, and that would keep the people oppressed and keep the people from building up. But I guess that was a question that really we talked about a lot was, can violence be used as a tool for revolution? And that also brought up the question of, is violence justified? And when do we know if we can use violence, and in instances where the only solution is to use violence to solve the issue, and kind of dealing with those moral questions and quandaries.
In terms of the difference between conflict and violence, we discussed a couple key differences. So we said that conflict is always mutual. There's different parties and they have mutual tension, and that tension leads to something occurring. But violence can be inflicted from one party onto the other, for instance, the oppressor onto the oppressed. And violence can be mutual in like two parties fighting each other, but it doesn't have to be mutual. And yeah, like structural violence can be like inflicted onto a group of people. And we also said that similar to that, conflict, it has defined parties that are experiencing the tensions, for instance, two groups of people, two nations, two friends. So like clear actors, but violence doesn't always have to be that, because we discussed the structural violence, which doesn't have clear actors, but it's more of an institutional thing. So that again makes it harder to see. But yes, those are our two main differences between conflict and violence.
Okay, and for the question about why is the difference between conflict and violence important, to answer that question, we said that if we acknowledge that not all arguments are violent, then we would be more open to having discussions, because people wouldn't be as scared and hesitant that conflict will lead to violence. So like we're saying that conflict, that violence is not necessarily the outcome, and it doesn't have to be the outcome and the result of conflict. So if we acknowledge it this way, and if we can open up more discussions that will lead to better and more constructive solutions. And if we successfully differentiate between the two concepts, violence and conflict, we would be able to arrive at the conclusion that conflicts, which are disagreements between parties that will bring about consequences and results, and violence could be one of these results, we would arrive at the conclusion that conflicts then would be unavoidable, while violence, if we treat it as a condition and the situation not as a tool, so it can be avoidable based on how and the strategies and the ways we use to tackle and approach conflicts and how constructive they are.
After our discussion, our group still had some lingering questions. The first being, can violence be justified? We were also curious about if our communities have access to the resources to observe and identify the structural violence occurring within them, and how access to resources to be able to identify and solve these problems, and or more so inability to the resources to be able to solve them, can deepen the structural inequalities that already exist. We were also curious about how one would go about quantifying violence, and how who is doing the quantifying would affect the way in which violence is measured. Our final question has to do with the struggle between two parties that are unequal in power and resources. In the readings, this was defined as a conflict, but we were curious if this would undermine the cause of the subjugated or the powerless, because it doesn't feel as much of a consenting to conflict as it does violence, because the oppressed or subjugated don't really have as much of a say.